to be an astrophysicist when I grow up, and I want that job to make me feel safe.
I want to be an engineer when I grow up, and I need to make sure that I get paid good. Even if I don't know what job I want to work when I grow up, I still want to work with people who respect me.
I want my job to be fun so I can be a Lego builder.
I want to be a singer when I grow up, but to do that, I want to make sure that all the crowds are safe, like if I'm ever up on stage. And also, I want to feel respected because sometimes people can laugh at a song or something.
Greetings. Today's session is a discussion on the dignity of work and the dignity of workers. In his encyclical, Laudate Si, Pope Francis states, quote, "We were created with a vocation to work. Work is a necessary part of the meaning of life on earth, a path to growth, human development, and personal fulfillment." So, Friar Tim, for some people, work is stimulating and psychologically rewarding. But for many others, work is a drudgery and demeaning. For the latter, how can work have dignity and be a path to personal fulfillment?
Thanks, Carl. That's an interesting question. When you look back in Christian history, work was not considered, frankly, positively. In the very famous Benedictine tradition of ora et labora, you orad, you prayed, and that's what you were called to, kind of the life of contemplation and relaxation, and you laborad, worked, as a penalty and a payment for sin. So work does have, even in the Christian tradition, this much more kind of a negative connotation to it. Frankly speaking, the Christian tradition on work gets much more positive only with St. Francis of Assisi, who invited the friars to consider work as a grace from God. And from that little inspiration of Francis considering work as a grace from God, the Christian tradition slowly began to understand work as co-creating with God, as contributing with God. Now, when you look at the history of economics and the history of growth, this gets much more problematic beginning in the 19th century, when the effects of one's work were separated from one. It's one thing to work a field and actually see the field produce something, or care for a flock and actually see the flock produce something. It's another thing when you're working on an assembly line and all you're doing is attaching 7,000 widgets a day and you see no production, you see nothing positive that comes from it. So the invite always is to see our work not as a penance for sin and not as some anonymous activity, but in fact, a path for us to co-create with God. This, of course, comes back to the whole question of the importance of still having some sense of the transcendence. That is, if you don't believe that you have a God who creates abundantly and positively and productively, and your work, in fact, co-creates with that God, then work is a drudgery, work is a dreary, work is positive. So the transcendent for us Christians is some answer to that kind of a question.
What means might the church take to preserve the dignity of work in a profit-driven economy that places a higher value on a lower cost of production over paying a just wage for workers?
Well, again, it's what the church does, which is sensitize consciences, forms consciences. And basically here, the question is to form consciences around the fact of a clear understanding of work. That is, work is something that is objective. The products that are done at the lowest cost possible so that consumers can afford to do them. That's an objective question of work. The subjective question of work is the human person that does all of that producing. Not only the sum of human production, but the human person that's involved in this. And for Christians, the human person always takes precedence over the whole question of the objective production. So it is a constant reminder of the importance of the dignity of the human person. It is a constant reminder that our society and our economy cannot merely be understood or regulated or fostering merely production and consumer growth and gross national product and gross domestic product and more production if that is done at the cost of workers. So it is a question always of coming back to the basic point of underlining the human dignity of workers, and that human dignity of workers has to take precedence and priority over money. Again, here's a fundamental question always for people. What is more important, money and products, or the people that produce them? And if we ask ourselves that very basic question, we might squirm a little bit at the answers that we give ourselves. Because lip service, so of course people are more important, but if people are more important, and that means I have to pay more for gas or groceries or clothing or anything else that I want, I'm not so sure whether that's true. So it's a question always of consciousness raising, of sensitizing, and a formation of conscience. That's what the church needs to do, and frankly, that's what the church's role is.
Well, today's economic expert is Bob Connolly, a member of our Newman community. He's a retired professor of finance and economics from the UNC School of Business. So Bob, beginning with the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, and in the years since, the Church has promoted the concepts of just wage and the rights of workers to organize into unions or other groups. Do we have the economic tools and social policies to achieve the desired outcomes in terms of just wages, labor laws, and regulations?
Thanks, Carl. What we have are trade-offs, and some of them are more unhappy than others. Economic research and real-world experience has generated a great deal of evidence on what promotes higher employment and wages and what limits both. Still, the world is messy, research on these issues is incomplete, and frankly, some of it is badly done. Data is very often not ideal, predictions are super challenging at times, and what works in one place may not work in another. So, humility is required all around in drawing conclusions. My bottom line is that there is room for far more thinking about how we might achieve the desired outcomes. Now, since the economic research is voluminous and I only have a few minutes, my aim is to address a few salient points at a very aggregated level. Employment and high wages follow from productivity. This is just another word for expertise broadly understood. And productivity reflects human capital, the labor side, capital commitments by employers, and stable social arrangements such as the rule of law. Successful interaction of labor and capital is essential for high productivity and is arguably less fruitful in an adversarial setting or where social institutions are weak. Wages in the United States are high relative to most of the rest of the world, reflecting many factors, including the extensive use of capital in economic enterprises. Capital commitments by owners are crucial to productivity, but they are more difficult to justify financially in a world where unions raise wages and limit productivity through work rules, and government raises costs directly through taxation and indirectly through regulation. The trade-off here is clear. Higher union or government regulatory costs impede capital commitments by businesses, and this limits the productivity of labor, employment levels, and wages. Now, before you claim that businesses should just take a lower rate of return, Remember, firms can move production to other places where the returns are better because the local resolution of the trade-offs I've described is more favorable. In addition, shares in public companies in the United States are in virtually every retirement plan, including union retirement plans, so lower returns now imply a smaller retirement account later. And this effect is very, very substantial over 25 to 30 years. The unmistakable decline in private sector unionization reflects many factors, prominent among which is the reduced fortunes of heavily unionized sectors. Employment in auto, steel, and other industries is limited relative to 50 years ago, and unions account for a much smaller proportion of total employment in the United States. The economic logic behind this is clear. Unionization inevitably raises costs, limits total employment, and favors existing workers over those who would like a job. There simply is no free lunch. Let's address wages a bit further. A substantial historical focus in Catholic social teaching has favored setting a relatively high minimum wage. The minimum wage focus may have made complete sense in 1906 when Father John Ryan published his book, A Living Wage, Its Ethical and Economic Aspects. The importance of minimum wage legislation in affecting family income may have been particularly important a century ago. Arguably, the world is quite different now in an economic sense, and this focus may achieve much less than in the past. Indeed, the number of workers in the US who are directly affected by minimum wage legislation is fairly small compared to a century ago. We ought to be clear about the trade-off that confronts us when we raise the minimum wage. Minimum wages that affect worker compensation without any offsetting effects on productivity make labor more expensive. This typically depresses employment, and the weight of evidence suggests this is exactly how labor markets are affected. Forced to raise wages, a small business that employs 20 people might be forced to cut back to 16 workers to balance their finances. In a world where production work can relocate to other countries, higher minimum wages can also lead firms to rearrange supply chains to take advantage of lower cost labor in other places. The point here is that the changing nature of work, the structure of industries, and the importance of international trade all highlight the changing nature of the trade-off involving higher minimum wage levels. There is no magic way in the long run to improve the lot of lower wage workers by simply mandating a higher minimum wage. There are trade-offs involved here. Economists have long argued that it is far more efficient to address low wages through the income tax system, rather than trying to move wage rates directly. This is an example of an alternative approach where the trade-offs are expected to be more favorable.
Friar Tim, does contemporary Catholic teaching actively promote the rights of workers to unionize and, if suitable, to strike for their rights?
Absolutely. This goes back to what you referenced talking to Bob Connolly, that is the whole question of rerum novarum. Rerum novarum, let's put it in its historical context, is 1891. This is after almost 3/4 of a century of the Industrial Revolution making its way through Europe and eventually into the United States and the rest of the world as well, at which early on laissez-faire capitalism basically viewed workers as commodities to be used up and thrown away. And it was very clear that the church had to give workers the right to organize in order for a certain level of protection. Now, rerum novarum, in a number of different things, threads a very fine needle between the rights of workers to organize and the communist notion of perpetual class warfare. Runs a very, very fine needle that yes, workers can organize, and yes, workers can strike if that's the only means necessary to do so. And again, please keep in mind that when the church is talking about the rights of workers to organize, that includes places with a well-developed social network like the United States and Western Europe, but that also includes workers in developing economies, most particularly in Africa and in Asia, where the labor force is large and very easily to be exploited. So the church's teaching around the positive right to organize and join in trade associations or labor unions, or however we want to classify them, is an important right to protect this more vulnerable population. But at the same time, it does not give it absolute rights and does not allow it to slip into class warfare.
Next question for you, Bob. Given the church's teachings, on what basis should we advocate particular arrangements in labor markets?
Thanks again, Carl. The USCCB online discussion of these issues draws heavily from many papal pronouncements, consisting largely of selected paragraphs from these documents. What's missing is any serious discussion of how this is to be done. Instead, the Church has long recognized that prudential judgment is essential in finding ways to achieve these desirable goals. Prudential judgment is an evaluation of a situation where we use the virtue of prudence to determine the best approach to resolving the issue at hand. The fundamental aim is to achieve good and avoid evil. Prudential judgment must recognize that there are trade-offs in the real world, and I alluded to this in the discussion of the first question. Thomas Sowell, a distinguished economist and author, notes that there are no solutions, just trade-offs. This is just another way of saying there are no free lunches. Not all trade-offs have the same moral weight, and this is precisely why the Church's long-standing recognition of prudential judgment is particularly important. My view is that any serious discussion of implementing the Church's social teachings must identify and negotiate these trade-offs. I see this as the core implementation question. Further, since legal and social institutions bear heavily on the nature of these trade-offs, my view is that the way forward might be significantly different in different countries. Accordingly, prudential judgment in one place might yield a different approach than in another. Weighing the details and institutional setting carefully also operationalizes the Church's principle of subsidiarity, where decisions are to be made at the lowest possible level rather than mandated from above. In practical terms, this implies that one-size-fits-all federal government policy may not be optimal.
Okay, Friar Tim, what more can the Church in the U.S. do to actively promote Catholic social teachings on just wage and on rights of workers?
Yeah, once again, it comes back to what the Church's proper role is, which is the formation of conscience and the formation of conscience that leads to decisions that can be made on a more ethical and just social order of an economy that is increasingly globalized. And notice at the end of this, an economy that is increasingly globalized. That's why the Church listens to the experts in things like economics and things like business management and things like government regulation. That's not the Church's proper role to get in and legislate or to enact policies in those kinds of ways. It is the Church's role to continue to have dialogues with experts, both in academe, in business, and in economics, as well as with policymakers in government, as well as with international organizations of any kind, to continually raise the questions of, is your profit-driven approach done at the expense of human rights and human dignity? If it is, then the Church has to continually question that. And that's the reason, for example, that there is an arm of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops that precisely lobbies the federal government around all of these things. That's also the reason why the Holy See has permanent observers at all kinds of international organizations like the United Nations and like many of the United Nations agencies that are worldwide that address these issues. Why? Is to continually raise the question of consciousness around this. And this is not merely a third world issue. Let's be very, very honest. The question of the rights of workers in the United States, church teaching still holds to what is called a living family wage, which was formally enacted into church teaching by Quadragesimo Anno in 1931, on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. Quadragesimo Anno, on the 40th anniversary. And a living family wage very clearly states that a family should be able, or a breadwinner should be able to, in his or her compensation, provide for family, housing, health care, pension, etc., where health care and pension are human rights, not human privileges. And arguments over things like the minimum wage don't even address these kinds of issues. So there is still quite a bit that needs to be done in consciousness raising here in the United States, as well as in an increasingly globalized economy. Again, it's a complex question, but the point of the church is that if we do not think ethically and biblically about very, very complex and complicated economic, business, and social issues, then those economic, social, and business issues will simply flit off on their own unless one thinks humanly, biblically, and spiritually, and ethically about what all this means. This is part of why we're doing this dialogue here today.
Well, thank you, Friar Tim, and thank you, Bob.
And thank you, Carl and Bob, and thank you all for listening. God bless.